Moving on, a Los Angeles jury reached a verdict in a lawsuit that claims the LA Dodgers baseball team is partly liable for injuries to a San Francisco Giants fan. Two Dodgers fans beat Brian Stowe unconscious after a game, and he now has injuries that require medical assistance for the remainder of his life. The jury decided that the Dodgers organization is 25% liable for those injuries. It failed to provide adequate security at the stadium. They said they must pay Stowe and his family at least $14 million. Paul Henderson is an attorney and trial lawyer who previously worked for a sports management firm, and he joins us from San Francisco, California. Hey, it's good to see you, Paul.
Thanks for having me back.
I really appreciate you coming on. Help us understand this just a little bit. Of course, I don't know how unusual it is for the team who owns the stadium to be held liable for what happened to a fan that attends a game. The LA Dodgers are liable for 25% of the overall judgment against this gentleman. Why did the Dodgers bear any responsibility?
Well, typically when you have third-party intervening factors like criminal action of a person, that breaks the liability. But in a case like this where you can prove negligence or liability where an owner of a property or a property management corporation knew or should have known that there was going to be liability, they end up having a ruling or a finding like this. And so some of the things that the jury evaluated in this case was the lack of security, which was alleged by the plaintiff in this case, and the lighting. They also considered things like the amount of alcohol sales, which were said to have been through the roof for the game. And so given those circumstances, the jury evaluated and made a determination that the Dodgers themselves should have known and were at least in part responsible for the damages that were caused by this attack, even though the defendants themselves had already taken a plea, had pled guilty, and have already been found guilty for the actions that they committed in creating this assault.
Yeah, that reason alone might be one of the reasons that the Dodgers appealed this decision. Do you think there's any chance that they'll ultimately pay this money?
I think there is. There's a couple of issues going on because typically even when you get a verdict like this and, you know, the defendants themselves were found to be 75% responsible, if they don't have any money, and in this case it's not likely that they do, you go after the deep pockets, right? So they went after the Dodgers here, who are only 25% liable, but in a civil case like this and in California, you are jointly and severally liable for all of the damages as they relate to the economic losses. So those are the medical injuries, the earnings. You're only limited in the pain and suffering, but even in the pain and suffering, they still have to pay over $1 million, the Dodgers that is, for their 25% portion. I would imagine that the baseball team would want to write that check and get this behind them as quickly as possible and just move on and not leave this out and open, so that fans have concerns about whether or not there's liability when they go to a game. I would imagine that they would want to move beyond this pretty quickly and put this history behind them. And I know the Stowe family is pretty excited, particularly in this case because the jury found that he was 0% liable for the incident that took place that night.
Mm-hmm. You know, the truth is $14 million for regular folk like you and me sounds like a lot of money. For a sports organization, it's not that much money at all. Will this judgment induce the Dodgers or any other sports teams to change any of their practices to reduce this type of culpability?
I think what they'll do is evaluate what their safety measures are, and it won't just be the Dodgers. I'm sure all of the baseball and sports franchises are paying attention to this verdict and are going to be watching to see what were the factors that the jury considered in finding liability. But in terms of that number specifically, the Dodgers pay out about $230 million a year. So this number isn't necessarily that large, but it would cause concern, I'm sure, for Major League Baseball. Same thing with NFL as well. One of the things that I think is really interesting in this case is that they also specifically sued the owner in this case of the Dodgers, and they wanted him to be found liable as well. In fact, it hung up the jury for over 9 days while they were trying to evaluate whether or not they could find the owner personally liable, and in this case, they could not come to a unanimous decision, and then he was not found liable. So I think that's really interesting, especially for these owners of these big teams that tend to have the deep pockets, and I know that they're paying attention to this decision as well.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Paul Henderson, it's great to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.